Hi, I'm Carol Anne Riddell, and welcome to Book It. It may be fall, but with the World Series, we're still thinking about the boys of summer. From fierce rivalries to hometown pride, baseball is an indelible part of our city. Joining us to talk about that is Kevin Baker, author of The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of a New City. Kevin, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Carol.
So the book spans from the 1800s until 1945. Tell us how baseball got its start.
Well, baseball, as we know it, really got its start in New York City. Mankind has been playing some kind of bat and ball game pretty much since we first swung down from the trees. Really, it goes back literally ages. But the New York game, as it came to be called, the Knickerbocker rules, really started here in New York. And modern baseball really is a very urban game. And it was played first really on the vacant lots and open fields of Manhattan and Brooklyn.
So not surprisingly, New York made the game its own. What are some of the innovations?
The innovations are pretty much everything we know as baseball. The 3 men out to an inning, 9 innings, 9 men in the field, an established batting order. The balk rule, although nobody understood it even then. All of these things. And the hard ball, which came about instead of, you used to have originally you had kind of a soft rubber ball, which the Massachusetts game used because you got guys out solely by hitting them with the ball.
Okay.
But in New York, we had the first real shortstop, this guy, Doc Adams. He got tired of running out to left field and taking relays. So he went to a Scotch saddle maker and got the first really sort of hard ball made. And that made a huge difference. It made it kind of a grown-up game with even a hint of death in it, which also happened in New York. The only time it's ever happened in the major leagues was also on a New York ball field. And it's a terrible story. It's this wonderful shortstop for the then Cleveland Indians, guy named Ray Chapman, young man, very jolly. His teammates loved him, used to sing in the locker room all the time, married, had a young child. And he got hit by a submarine pitch, a sort of sidearm pitch, very hard to detect, from a pitcher on the Yankees named Carl Mays, and hit him in the head. And it cracked his skull, and he went into a coma soon afterwards and died. Amazingly, it still took Major League Baseball over 20 years to start requiring people to wear helmets after this. It's one of those things people talk about, is the game harder today or back in the day? And it's one of those great debates that they keep having about baseball. A lot of people today will say, well, they throw much harder today. They throw somewhat harder today. On the other hand, nobody wore body armor. Nobody wore helmets up there.
Which is kind of hard to fathom, given the speed of that ball, what the game is like.
You were really taking your life in your hands in many ways.
Kevin, racism was pervasive in baseball, despite there being so many incredibly talented black players. Tell us about that history.
Yeah, it's a terrible history, as it is in America in general. The ball field was a place for everybody where they could come and fight and compete and have a beer afterwards. Except very early on, there was an ongoing attempt to exclude black players, black and many Hispanic players. There were still 55 known black and Hispanic players in the majors or minors until 1898, but the last black players in the majors are in 1884, and they're excluded until Jackie Robinson is signed by the Dodgers over 60 years later. A horrible thing, but it's also a somewhat triumphant story just in that these players found a way where there was no way. They found a way to start their own leagues, to play some great baseball, and it's a shame they weren't more recognized. It's a shame they were excluded, but they also came up with their own leagues, their own games, and really improved the game in many ways.
Yes, and you mentioned Jackie Robinson, as we said before. Your book ends in 1945. Before he breaks the color barrier, but as I understand it, Volume 2 is coming.
Volume 2, spring of 2026. Robinson is kind of ends just as the Dodgers are about to sign him. And he's going to come in the major leagues, and that will finally pull down the color wall.
Yeah.
And this was a terrible thing that this went on so long. And very illicit. You know, by this point in the 40s, a lot of major league teams could make money on Negro League teams playing in their parks when they were away. They rented them out.
Yep.
So there was a big monetary interest in this. But that all came tumbling down, and again, in New York.
So let's talk a little bit about the next book. I imagine then that Jackie Robinson is going to play very prominently in that book.
Jackie Robinson is on the cover
Awesome.
of that
Great.
book. Yeah, and the whole change in the game and in the city as it goes on after World War II.
So we have to talk about a few of the big stars in the book, starting with Babe Ruth. You say in the book that he really brought baseball into the big time.
Yes.
I want to hear how, and I also have to hear more about what he ate and drank, because your description in the book, I couldn't believe.
I think it's, as a teammate of Babe Ruth's, I think Wade Hoyt said, all the lies about Babe Ruth are true. You know, he ate constantly, he drank constantly. That was pretty common in the majors at the time. Probably the strangest, weirdest thing he did was he used to slug he used to chug an entire pitcher of iced tea. Tea, ice cubes, lemon slices, and all. I don't know how a human being does this, but he was really this prodigious Rabelaisian figure.
Yeah.
I think he's the most transformative athlete in history. Certainly many people worldwide, many more people know who Muhammad Ali or Michael Jordan is, but it was Ruth who first brought Major League Baseball into the big time. The Yankees, when they get him, they have the first million-fan gate.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And that brought American sports into the big time, and world sports followed.
Joe DiMaggio, an American icon, what, in your opinion, was his biggest impact on the sport?
Just the epitome of class and an ethnic hero in the 1930s in New York, when the city and to a certain degree America were finally beginning to embrace other ethnicities besides, you know, Anglos. He was just a fantastically classy ball player, very intense, and a lot has been written sort of trying to show that, well, the veneer of him maybe wasn't the real DiMaggio. But he was somebody who essentially came from nothing. He was barely educated. The Yankees ownership kind of hung him out to dry when he dared to hold out for a raise. So against all this, he just made himself an epitome of class and an epitome of how the city and the country wanted to think of themselves in the teeth of the Depression.
Yeah. Lou Gehrig, of course. You say in the book that he made the Yankees human. I think most of us are familiar with, to some degree, with his speech, but tell us a little bit about what you meant by that.
Yeah, he was somebody who was extremely modest, very shy, usually overshadowed by, he played with both Ruth and with DiMaggio, usually overshadowed by them. But he gets struck down by ALS, what became known as Lou Gehrig's disease. At the height of his career, he's this young man. Everyone's horrified by this. They throw a big day for him at Yankee Stadium. He's really having trouble, even then, standing up for a long period of time. And he's too overwhelmed by the tribute to speak at first. But his manager urges him to do it. And he says the famous lines about how you may have heard about a bad break, but today I consider myself the luckiest man.
For the past 2 weeks, you've been reading about a bad break. Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
That positivity is just astounding, right?
Amazing. And he thanks everybody. He thanks the ball boys. He thanks the New York Giants who sent a present. He thanks his wife and his parents who were there and all weeping. And he says at the end, yeah, I may have had a bad break, but I have an awful lot to live for. And he would be dead in less than 2 years.
Kevin, I heard you say in an interview that in those early years of baseball, the gods walked among us, meaning that even these like massive baseball stars were very much a part of their neighborhood, a part of their community, so different from the way that we sort of view and interact with celebrities today. What was that like?
Oh, very much so. In a way, they were even more beloved. It's sort of the way you used to have hill gods before we had sky gods. They were all the more awesome for being right there. Gehrig used to go and play with little boys in a sandlot when he came home.
Amazing, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
All these
Right,
guys.
like-
Willie Mays famously played stickball in the streets of Harlem
Yeah.
with neighborhood kids. Almost all the old Brooklyn Dodgers lived in the neighborhood, often year-round. Mickey Mantle used to walk to the stadium from through Central Park, that you would see these people among you, and it was all the more astounding. It's like the game was sort of more in perspective. It meant a lot to people. We were fanatics even then, but at the end of the day, you went home to the neighborhood.
A last question for you. Would baseball be what it is today without New York? And would New York be what it is without baseball?
Well, great question. I think both have contributed a great deal to each other. I think the baseball was very much shaped by the city it grew up in, even by the corruption. And with the city in general, you quickly had people of all different classes, all different ethnicities mixing on the ball field, which really symbolizes New York too. And so baseball helped that along. Could have done better, as we all could have in some ways. New York City is really the heartland of America. It's where it has been fought out, sometimes terribly, bitterly, bloodily on the streets, just what it means to be an American and who is going to be an American. But more than anywhere else, that's been the continuing struggle here. And I think more than anywhere else, it has succeeded.
Thank you for all this time, Kevin.
Thank you.
What a pleasure it was to talk with you. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Next up, our Isabel Ortiz is back with us from the podcast studio. Let's head there now.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking Books. I'm Isabel Ortiz, and today I have the pleasure of sitting down with author María Alejandra Barrios Vélez to discuss her debut novel, The Waves Take You Home. Hi Maria, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi Isabel, absolutely my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.
You can tell really that your heart was in these pages. The way you talked about Barranquilla, Colombia, your home, it truly was beautiful and really inspiring. I would love if you can tell us a little bit about the novel and your inspiration for it.
So The Waves Take You Home is a novel about Violeta Sanoguera, a Colombian 28-year-old woman that lives in New York, and she has her life here. She's an artist, she has a partner, and however, after her abuela dies, she has to return to Colombia for the burial. And in that moment, she learns that she inherited the family restaurant, which is a little bit complicated because it was the place where her abuela always told her to run from.
Throughout the book, there is a common theme of strong Latina women. I was really excited to see that representation come to life.
Right.
And the person that is at the center of all this is Doña Emilia. She is Violeta's grandmother, her abuela. Why was it really important for you to discuss this concept of the matriarch, especially in terms of Latina culture?
I was always interested in showing in a story how matriarchs are the way they are because they have to be everything for everyone. So they're often seen as like harsh, or like that their words are very cutting, or that they can be like a certain way. But we also have to examine the ways that these women have to be strong all the time, have to work a lot, have to make ends meet. Sometimes like the male figures are not there, so they have to do everything on their own.
And we see that V gets a lot of pressure put onto her from her grandmother and from her mother. And it's kind of a lot of generational trauma in regards to love and fear. Why did you think this was so important to include, and especially in the context of maybe love and relationships?
When I wrote the book, I was like in my mid-20s and throughout, and that was something that I was thinking about a lot, how in my family, I can't speak for all Latino families, but there was always like this chatter that was like warnings all the time, like don't do this, don't wear that, maybe don't feel like this in terms of love, or like don't get overexcited, or If a guy does this, it means X or Y. And it was always like constant. I think at the time, obviously, my head was like, oh, I don't know, this is annoying. Like, I want to make my own decisions, etc. But like with time, I started thinking about it more. And it is like a way of passing, yes, warnings, like for the story not to repeat. But it's also like a reaction to the environment, to the stories lived throughout generations, right?
Yeah.
And like the love stories too. So I kind of wanted to portray that in the book and also explore like what it would really mean to break that cycle. Mm-hmm. That sometimes it isn't pretty. Like you have to, like it takes a lot of self-exploration, sure, but also exploration of the stories that came before you.
Your book talks about and handles grief in a way that I haven't really seen before, where that V's abuela makes a ghostly return.
Yeah.
And there's this aspect of magical realism that I haven't seen, and it in ways is V's chance to get her questions that she's had forever answered.
Yeah.
So why did you feel like doing it in this way where her grandmother is a ghost? What made you decide to include this kind of form of magical realism in the book?
So I always had that idea, and I always knew that I wanted for my first book to have magical realism in it and to have a ghost, because I love ghosts. But also, I think it came a lot from my own heart. Like, after losing my abuela, I just kept thinking, like, wow, I really wish I had, like, one more time. I've heard that a lot in people's, like, grief process. Like, I wish I had one more time. Or, like, you start wondering about all these questions that you had for them.
Yeah. A lot of people, too, they want closure and that final goodbye.
Yeah. That final goodbye, exactly. Like, you never get to say goodbye. And that was also another thing that I wanted to portray in the book, which is, I think, like, an unfortunate experience that a lot of immigrants like myself experience, like, not getting the opportunity to say goodbye in person to loved ones. So that is something that is very, very heartbreaking. I'm sure that it's in books, but I had never seen in a book. And I wanted to take the opportunity to just portray it. And yeah, maybe if someone reads it and it's going through the same thing, that they could find comfort.
But now that your debut novel, The Waves Take You Home, is out, what's up for you now in the future? What are you working on next?
Well, now I am putting finishing touches on a story about three sisters. And it's similar in the sense that it's also family drama. I'm very interested in family stories. But this one is about strange sisters that come to New York. And their relationship fractures, and the oldest one is getting married. The youngest one does not want to attend the wedding. So it is like all about what happened and like how they navigate that. It also deals with like immigration and finding your place in the world.
Okay. My interest is piqued, and I can't wait for it to come out. But
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here today. This was incredible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It was so fun.
Today in the fine print, we are talking comics and not just superheroes. Comics and graphic novels are serious art forms and increasingly popular. Joining us today, Sandy Jimenez, a comic book artist and writer who's also a graduate student here at CUNY. Thanks so much for stopping by, Sandy.
Thanks for having me.
So let me start by asking you, when did you first fall in love with comics?
The short answer is probably on first sight.
Okay.
But very early on, my mother got a collection of Popeye cartoons. And I think that at that time, a lot of the animated shorts were running. So I had this real sense that reading a comic turns everyone into a kind of animator, puts a movie into their head. And yet here was this thing in my hands that I very much had a sense was created by a person who drew it, wrote it. And I think that was its initial appeal to me, for sure.
And what draws you to the form now as an adult?
I think the fact that it has such power, such democratic power, the fact that anyone who puts the time into it can do it, whether they're doing something in nonfiction, whether they're doing something more literary, they can just write a script, they can put together, the componentry is all within someone's hands, as opposed to other forms. You know, if you want to create a modern opera, you need a lot of people, you need a budget, you need a location, you need to do all kinds of things.
Sure.
None of that is necessary. You know, a comic book, as many artists have said, if you want to shoot something that takes place in ancient Egypt, you know, you need a budget. These days, you at least need a CGI team to create the environments for you.
Yeah.
But you can just draw 3 triangles in a panel, and everybody knows where you're taking them.
There's a universality to that, I suppose.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So talk to me a little bit about the misconceptions or maybe the stereotypes around comics. You know, for example, the idea, oh, they're for kids.
You know, I think that comics will probably always have some battle to fight in that regard because of their origins. They're a pop culture form. So some people will never respect rock and roll and pop music, even though there have been figures like Bob Dylan who clearly have great poetic contributions to society.
That's a really interesting analogy, yeah.
And comics, because of their immediacy, have that power, but there's always going to be this sort of low art, folk art, commercial art. You know, for people who want to look at it that way, that there'll always be that to bite into if they want to, but it is an open art form, and it has a lot of potential to do many other things.
And it's probably much more complex and complicated to produce than people realize, I imagine. I mean, you could tell us that.
Absolutely. You know, a lot of my colleagues have said, you know, the better we get at it, the easier it looks to the public.
Yeah.
So when you look at something like Calvin and Hobbes, or, you know, the Peanuts, or look at anything being done today in these very sort of open sort of styles that are very accessible because they're meant to be as universal as possible, that looks like nothing went into it. And that's kind of the trick, right?
Yes.
A magic trick should not reveal its process.
That's right.
But there's actually, as most artists will tell you, any amount of reduction or distillation of complex things into simple things is actually a very hard process to navigate.
Sandy, I think sometimes people are not clear on the difference between comics and graphic novels. So could you try to explain that for us?
You know, I would say the most immediate distinction that people understand somewhat intuitively, but not, express, in explicit terms, is that comic books, historically, when you're referring to a comic book, is something that is a periodical. A graphic novel is a self-encapsulated work, a monolithic work that is not meant to be episodic necessarily. There may be sequels to it, but it's more of a cousin to the novel, to certain literary forms, as opposed to a comic book, which has more in common probably with a magazine in terms of the way it appears, the way you're expected to follow it month after month after month. The forms that build both of them are very much common to both. The fact that you're using images and texts to create a narrative. In panels generally.
Yes. So I know that you are involved in an effort to bring comics and graphic arts more mainstream in terms of academic study. Can you explain that?
Well, when I came here to the biography and memoir program, which is run by Sarah Covington here at the Graduate Center, we had discussions about what we could do to bring this new form that, with books like Dr. Rebecca Hall's Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, which is a book that came out in 2023 that's a magnificent piece of graphic novel. Really, it's a graphic memoir. It's nonfiction, bringing the processes of the making of a work like that into the Graduate Center, because it is yet another tool for nonfiction, or another form for nonfiction. So the conversations we had ended up in a class being taught here by Sarah Gomez-Woolley called Visual Narratives. And it was on the actual the process of making a nonfiction comic.
So you are actually working on a graphic memoir, is that right? Can you tell us about that?
I boldly announced it in 1995 and then didn't get to it until now. And I think that I knew that I wasn't ready to do this particular story. It's about the South Bronx in the 1970s and the arson fires and my life in that time, along with the lives of my mother and my friends and the people who grew up in those neighborhoods. So I knew that I needed a nonfiction framework. I knew that where there was this grand discipline called, nonfiction, that it was a subset of history. But as someone who had only gone to art school and was a practitioner, I didn't really have the the way to even find out where it was being taught and the way that I needed to learn it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So
All of
how's it
that
going?
happened. It's going great. I will be working on my capstone, which is this graphic novel in the fall under the advisement of Jason Tuga.
Yeah.
It's the research has been very, very illuminating and bizarre and surprising.
Yeah, sounds really interesting. Sandy, just a last question for you. What is one thing that you would like people to understand about comics as an art form?
That it is an art form like other art forms and therefore is capable of many things, perhaps many more things than most people suspect.
All right. So interesting. Thank you so much for all this time today, Sandy. Really appreciate your coming by.
I really appreciate you having me.
All right, take care. Thank you.
All right.
All right, now we're going to head over to Linda Stasi, author and columnist for Uncensored. As always, she has plenty to say about what she's reading.
In our not-so-brave new world of AI, 24/7 opinion disguised as news, and paid influencers, maybe the saying that everything old is new again no longer applies. Or does it? It sure seems to, at least when it comes to old books. Take Jane Austen, who is more alive now than when she actually was alive. Every time you turn on TV, there's another Agatha Christie movie or series. And except for the Bible and Shakespeare, she remains the best-selling author of all time. Another deceased author who is about to become readers' new obsession is Anne Schlee, whose novel Rhine Journey, published first in 1980, has recently been re-released to great acclaim. Not your typical read. It's about a woman who J.D. Vance would call an unmarried cat lady, although I'm not sure whether she has a cat or not. Back then, she was called the equally unflattering term spinster. Now, she'd probably be called CEO. At any rate, during the Victorian era, Charlotte had been relegated to the role of housekeeper because she was an unmarried lady and thus without status. When her employer dies, Charlotte takes a Rhine River cruise with her Reverend brother Charles, his spoiled, sickly wife, and their high-spirited teenage daughter. Charlotte's employer has left her a small inheritance, and she finally has some time and money of her own. On the trip, Charlotte serves as companion to her sister-in-law and guardian to her niece. When the family meets a man on board who looks just like Charlotte's long-lost love, a man her brother deemed below her station, Charlotte's forgotten and suppressed longings begin to resurface. Will she remain the lonely companion to others or find her own way for the first time in her life? What a read! It can't be long before Anne Schlee book clubs and festivals start popping up too. Rhine River cruise, anyone? Speaking of old is new again, against my better judgment, I bought Hillbilly Elegy, which was once again a bestseller. Sheesh! That's $16 in a week of my life I'll never get back. In the book, J.D. Vance whines about his poor childhood, and meantime, his mother and one of her many husbands made over $100,000. They lived in a house with a swimming pool and had new cars. Wah, wah, wah. This is a guy who denigrates women without children, and yet the whole book is about what a terrible mother his own mother was, what with her addictions to drugs and men. The woman got married more than most of us get manicured, went on benders, and J.D. often lived with his grandparents. He also says that women should stay in abusive marriages, but writes that his beloved grandparents, Mamaw and Pawpaw, lived separately due to abuse. Between the bad writing and the whining, Hillbilly Elegy should have been titled Hillbilly Bullcrap. For Uncensored, I'm Linda Stasi.
That wraps up another chapter for us. Thanks so much for watching. A quick reminder to check us out on the CUNY TV app and on social. Let us know what you're reading. I'm Carol Anne Riddell. See you next time on Book It.